In this video, we're going to discuss the rifled musket and the mini ball. When it comes to military firearms, or black powder muzzleloading military firearms, the rifled musket and the mini ball is one of my favorites. I really enjoy shooting these guns. They're a lot of fun, and also in the era of muzzle loaders, as it was fading out, this weapon system was probably the best of all. It was a normal progression to this point, and sadly, the way things evolved so quick because of the two major conflicts in the 1860s, which proved these weapons out, which was the American Civil War and the Crimean War against England and Russia. Now, we'll just look at it. Military muskets have existed since, say, the 1400s or even before. Okay, firearms of some sort. Now, be it whether they be matchlocks, wheel locks, flintlocks, and then eventually, as the progression went in ignition systems, they came up with the percussion cap lock. Okay, which is, as a progression, the best technology for black powder muzzleloading firearms, and it was a progression. Okay, the one thing that did not change is the barrels. All muskets were smooth bore, usually 75, 69 caliber, somewhere in there, and that did not change for hundreds of years. And even though rifles did exist and were used by the military, they were always a specialized weapon. They were not the general firearm issued to troops en masse. Rifles were used, but people using the rifles were specialized soldiers. Okay? And the reason for that is when you use any firearm that is using black powder as an ignition or as a propellant for your projectile, the minute you fire one round, you're going to get fouling or residue in the bore. Okay? And it's quite heavy, and it does build up very rapidly. So the only way around this problem with this form of technology is to use an undersized projectile, which with the smoothbore muskets, let's say like that French gun I have, the idea was you had a tube and paper cartridges did exist. Ammunition was made, you drop a ball down, there's a powder charge in there, and all the way to the Revolutionary War. You had a little packet, you tear the end of the packet off, put some in the pan to prime it, dump the rest down, and if you see, a lot of times the people take the remainder of that paper container, because the ball is undersized and just about, if it doesn't drop after a few shots with the fouling, it'll very gently push down. Okay, and they would take the remainder of that paper and kind of tamp it down on the top to hold the ball in. But what happens is when you fire the gun, it can be rapidly reloaded, and the gun can be reloaded a number of times before the fouling gets too bad. Is you have an undersized projectile going down a tube with no rifling, and what you're doing is you're just launching this thing and it's kind of rattling down the bore and flies out. So two things happen. One, it's inaccurate, and two, you're not getting a real good seal or velocity. Okay, your velocity suffers. But this is just the nature of the weapons, and for hundreds of years that was the thing to do, because a military weapon, the way war was fought, is two groups of men stood on a field, and it was the volume of this inaccurate fire that decided the outcome of the barrel. And for many years, people tried to figure out a way to make a military weapon that was rifled so you can get better accuracy, better velocity, but he had to overcome the problem of the fact that every time you fired the gun, a whole bunch of fouling and unburnt residue started to clog up the barrel. Because in actuality, you can get about 2-3 shots out of a rifle before it's really difficult to ram a patch ball or a ball down there. And another thing you got to remember with a rifle is when you start a muzzle loading rifle, you're engaging the bullet at the muzzle into the rifling. So that's why you used to see people with wooden mallets or something tap the bullet down, and once it gets in, you can push it down with the ramrod. But you're basically making the bullet engage the rifling at the muzzle, and that's why they're super accurate, okay? But you can't do that for a rapid fire military weapon. So over the years, there were a lot of different theories and ideas on how to correct this, how I can get a rifled musket and rapidly reload it. I think, try to get at least 10 shots out of it before it became inoperable. So all the way back into the 1830s, different people tried designing it, and the one person that come up was Claude Minier. And what he did is he's the one that come up with the idea of making a lead bullet with a base, and I think Minier's had an iron plug in there. So the bullet is undersized, so the bullet will go down the barrel and be able to be rammed down with ease because it's undersized. And then the idea was when the main charge went off, it drove the little iron plug up, and the bottom half of the bullet would expand out into the rifling, seal the bullet in there, and then that would engage the rifling, giving you the accuracy and velocity that you needed. That's basically how the principle worked. And that started in the 1830s. Now, also, there was another theory running parallel, which is a compression bullet. And how a compression bullet is different from a mini ball, and it's about the same time. A compression bullet is cast, it is undersized, and it has some large deep grooves in it. Now these grooves are not for lubrication. What's done is when you put the compression bullet in the rifled musket barrel and it's fouled, the bullet's undersized. So the bullet will go down to the bottom of the barrel, okay, with ease. Then what you had to do is pound on the bullet with the ramrod, and basically them deep grooves would collapse the bullet, the lead would spread out, and you'd basically tamp it down to where you crush, or that's why it's called a compression bullet, compress the bullet to engage the rifling down in the breech area. Okay? That was another thing. I have an example of a compression bullet. And these were used in the Lorenz musket, which was a popular one, and those older, the Garibaldi rifle. That was a weapon system from Austria that used a compression bullet. And that was another way around it. But the mini ball, because other people worked on it, reading the history here, there were several American officers that tried changing it. And I have a drawing here, James H. Burton, 1855 design. Okay, he worked at the Harper Ferry Armory. Well, in the end, the Minier was the system that was used, either, just the fact that the Americans pushed it or whatever. It was used in the American Civil War and was used in the Crimean because the 1853 Enfield musket was very similar to these Springfield ones, and I have two examples here. And these were both the English rifles, rifled muskets, were also used by both sides in the American Civil War. So, let's take a look at some of the bullets. Here I have two examples of some bullets. This is a copy of the 58 caliber mini ball, and this here is a compression bullet. I kind of found that by mistake. I can't get a mold, but I know a company that I can get them cast. And this is a 69 caliber. This is a 58 caliber. Now, if we look at our paperwork, you will see here, if you look and see, the 1855 had a pretty sharp point in that base, where on this bullet, this later style, that base is pretty cavernous. And when you use 60 grains of powder with this, it blows the base out. You got to use like 45 grains, unless you get another bullet that has a stronger skirt and base to it. And that's how it works. Basically, the bullet is undersized. There's 3 grease grooves on it, so you can lubricate this bullet on the outside. It is undersized, drops down the bore, and then when you fire it, this whole lower base expands out, engages the rifling. Now, how a compression bullet works, is a bit different. If you look at it, there's that deep groove. That is not for lubrication. What you would do, and this is a 69 caliber, this is an odd bullet. What this thing was designed for is trying to get more efficiency out of a smooth bore 69 caliber musket, because there are a lot of older muskets that were converted from flint to cap lock and in service. And what you would do is load this down, and this is undersized because I put it in my 69. It'll glide down in there much like the mini ball. And then what you would do is get it on top of the powder, and when you hit it with the rammer, that groove would collapse, and then this bullet would expand out and engage the smooth bore. Even though there's no rifling, it would seal tighter in the smooth bore. So that would give you more velocity, and I'm assuming also the fact that this bullet was sealed into the barrel itself would help scrape out the prior fouling as you shot the bullet, creating a more efficient and effective musket. But this one here beat it hands down, because what happened is the accuracy on this is outstanding, and I'll show you when I go fire these guns. Way better than a smooth bore musket with an undersized bullet. The velocity, because it is engaging the rifling and it is sealing in the barrel, it creates better velocity. Okay, so it's a more efficient and effective projectile, more accurate. But on the other hand, it had devastating effects. It was more deadlier. And if you read through the history of it, you'll see that they found out once these things got in service, the wounds created by these bullets traveling at a higher velocity and with the weight and more stability went through targets. It tore arms and legs off. It shattered bones. They were more effective at terminating life is basically what happened. So you had 2 or 3 things that happened with the invention of this bullet, and that came to a conclusion during the Battle of Gettysburg, because when the Confederate forces attacked, they were still armed with an assortment of guns, which some of them were smoothbore muskets, where the Union side by this point in the war was able to just about field everyone there with a rifled musket, which was capable of accurate fire out to 300 yards. So when Confederate forces en masse and attacked, they did that thinking that the weapons were not effective enough to reach them at a distance, and they could cross the field and get there without taking casualties at a closer range to ensue the battle. Unfortunately, they were mistaken, and accurate fire cut the men down at distances of 300 yards, and as they advanced, they just lost more and more people, to where that was what turned the battle, is this technology did it. So that's why I'm kind of impressed with this. We'll go back and wrap the video up. Okay, so in conclusion, a lot of people go, why, old 180-year-old technology and that. In terms of firearms development and the history of military firearms, these muskets represent a watershed moment. They perfected something that was effective, efficient, and actually devastating on the battlefield. This was a huge leap forward, technology-wise, in warfare. Unfortunately, within 10 years, less than 10 years, it was eclipsed by breech-loading, self-contained cartridges, metallic self-contained cartridges. So these guns, the minute they had their moment in the sun and were a viable military weapon, within a matter of, less than a decade, they were obsolete and something new would replace them. A lot of these guns were converted into some sort of a cartridge firing gun by one means or another. But another thing too, and see, for me, as a person who studies military weapons and history, for me to go out and become proficient with a modern day replica of this and learn the ins and outs of it and become good with this rifle, okay, is something I do for my own personal satisfaction. All right. And also another thing, when studying this, realizing how this works, the principle of a small diameter bullet that expands outward upon the combustion of the propellant, this principle carried on all the way to World War I. And what it was is two modern day cartridges, okay, that use smokeless powder, used a similar principle. So you have to remember, when they invented smokeless powder about 20 years later in the 1880s, how do you get a metal jacketed projectile to engage the rifling? Any old idea. You go back and look at what they had. The first cartridge developed by the French for the Lebel rifle used this principle. It was a jacketed bullet with a plug in the base, and when you fired the cartridge, when the powder charge went off, it drove a plug up and made the rifle bullet engage the rifling. This did not last long. The French didn't like the idea, scrapped it, and it was, a footnote in history. The Austrians, on the other hand, with the 8mm by 50, whenever you look at that bullet and the confusion and all this stuff that goes on about reloading for it, and people telling me that, when you measure the groove diameter of one of those guns, the groove diameter is anywhere from 329 to 332, much like the M95. But if you look at the ammunition and examine it from the period, the bullet is a much smaller diameter, okay? But I have seen in cartridge collectors where they have retrieved a fired bullet from the 8x50, and the rifling is engraved just about and heavily throughout the whole length of that torpedo bullet. So what happens with that is this technology was still used. There is a plug in the base of that jacketed bullet. When you fire it, the plug drives up and it goes and bumps out that bullet to engage the rifling. This technology lasted until World War I. Okay? Same principle. How you get the understanding is by understanding the history of firearms and the development of weapons, where this translates. Because when I go to do the reloading, I'm going to use a cast bullet that is sized to 234. And people are going, where did you come up with that? Where are you getting that diameter? That's wrong. It should be 324, not 34. And I'll prove it out, okay? but I kind of got the understanding and the knowledge to kind of circumvent this problem through learning about this type of weapon and the principles behind it and how it actually operates. And that's another thing. I do go out and shoot these guns and come proficient with the weapons system. Okay, that's another thing other than just sitting here and lecturing. We're going to go out and put some rounds down range. Alright, so that's my thoughts on it. We're going to do some more videos covering this gun, and hopefully it might be another week or so before I get out when the weather's nice to shoot it.